Well, hi. Welcome to Basic Folk, honest conversations with folk musicians. I'm Cindy House, your host. Very happy to be here. Today, we have a folk music legend on the podcast today. Jim Kweskin is our guest, and before we get into what we talk about, let's thank our sponsors. Basic Folk receives support from McDean, songwriters who love each other. McDean would be delighted to send you a free CD of their first EP, The Sampler Plate. Email lin@mcdean.co, lin@mcdean.co to get one. Jim Kweskin is maybe the most famous person you might not know. You might know him, but you might not. With the Jim Kweskin Jug Band, he mixed together folk and jazz, which invigorated the pretty much straight-laced Cambridge folk scene in the 1960s. That jug band went on to inspire other jug bands that later became acts like the Grateful Dead and the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. He was a regular at the Club 47, which is now known as Club Passim. Jim talks about how he came to the jug band style and how his band's relaxed stage presence changed the dynamic of the live folk show in profound ways. Jim also talks about his early life and his interest in music in general, but especially being drawn to early jazz from the 1920s and 30s, which at the time he was a young man growing up in like the 50s and early 60s, and like basically he was the only one he knew except for his dad that listened to that type of jazz. So very interesting early interest. It would later come to define his musicality throughout his career. We also talk about his very interesting connection to Bob Dylan and how Dylan took him to visit Woody Guthrie in the hospital towards the end of Woody's life. Jim is a really interesting guy with so much historical knowledge on the topic of jazz, folk, and jug band music. So glad we got a chance to do this interview. We're going to take a listen to a song from a 2017 release he put out called Unjugged. It is his version of Staggeredly, and then we'll get to our conversation with Jim Kweskin on Basic Folk.
Staggerly went down to the levee just about the break of day. He spied Billy gambling, so he sat down to play. Staggerly and Billy, they gambled mighty late. Staggerly pulled a 7, Billy swore that he pulled an 8. Now Staggerly said to Billy, you can't get away with that. Bad enough you take my money, you can't have my Stetson hat. Staggerly said to Billy, you better get on by the track. I ain't gonna kill you now, but don't be here when I get back. Oh, Staggerly.
All right, first of all, thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
You too.
So we're going to talk about a lot of your life, like an all-encompassing life interview. So you grew up in Stamford, Connecticut, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and you grew up listening to old-timey music that you found in your father's record collection?
Yeah, not exactly old-timey. Old-timey usually refers to like old Appalachian mountain country music. That's the general term for that. But my father had, at one point in his younger life, he had a used furniture store. By the time I came along, he had a different kind of store, but so he was buying and selling all kinds of furniture, including old phonograph record players. In the old days, they were pieces of furniture, and they often had records came with the phonograph record players.
Those like the tall, wooden things.
Like a cabinet.
What is it? It smells like something. My parents have one, and it has like a very distinct, sharp,
it's
ancient
probably
smell.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but you're right. Anyway, so they often had records in them so my father would go through the records and find the ones that he particularly wanted to listen to, and mostly they were early jazz from the 20s and early 30s. And by the time I came along, those records were in a cabinet in our house, and it was people like Jelly Roll Morton, Sidney Bechet, Louis Armstrong's Hot 5 and Hot 7, Bick Spiderbeck, Bessie Smith. There was a couple of Lead Bellies.
So was this the kind of music that like cool people were listening to in the 20s and 30s?
Yes.
Like hipsters?
Well, I don't know. It was more like people who like jazz. Um, there were many different forms of music, of course, going on in life at all times. But jazz, well, the 20s was called the Jazz Age, and so jazz was popular. Although most of the jazz that was popular was quote unquote popular jazz.
Hmm.
The let's say more real jazz musicians were some of the great musicians of all time. I mean, Louis Armstrong was an innovator, and so was Jelly Roll Morton, and people like Fats Waller and Cab Calloway, and they were all. And my father had records by all of these people, and it was music that had already gone out of popularity by the time I came along, because I was born in 1940. So by 49, 50, 51, in that era, that music was long out of style. But I fell in love with it.
Yeah, what was it about it that was appealing to you?
It's a good question, and I don't really know. It just appealed to me, and it was everything about it. I just loved the way it sounded. I loved the way it felt. It just, I suspect maybe, if you believe in those things, from a previous life.
I do, yeah. I can get into that.
Me too, because and nowadays you see kids come into this world who can already play the Mozart on the piano when they're 5 years old. So they must have come in already knowing how to do it to some degree. Anyway, be that as it may, I fell in love with that music, and I was the only person that I knew other than my father who liked that music. My kids I hung out with, all my friends, they never even heard of it, let alone like it. And and the music that was popular was what my friends were listening to, and all through the 40s and into the early 50s, it was the popular music of the day, and it was, people like Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole and Peggy Lee and Tony Bennett and all those quote-unquote pop singers.
Right. With that later on turned into, I work in radio, and that type of music turned into like MOR, the format middle of the road. You ever heard of that?
Yes, and it would be that, yes, although some of it was a little edgier than that, but it was certainly what became that kind of, just kind of almost like elevator music. But some of it was very high quality. Some of it was really good. And then in the late 40s and into the early 50s is when rhythm and blues started to come along, and my friends loved rhythm and blues.
Mm-hmm.
We got totally into Fats Domino and Chuck Berry and the Drifters and the Platters and doo-wop and all that stuff. So when I was in high school, pop music was still going on, and then around when I was 15, 16, Elvis Presley happened, and that turned into rock and roll. All of this was going on, and all of that music I did love. I loved rhythm and blues. I loved rock and roll. I loved pop music. I loved it all. It was not everything, but the ones that I liked, the good ones. But still, I was also totally listening to early jazz, and I was the only one that I knew who was.
Was that something that made you feel different in a good way?
Yes. Yeah, sure. Although I wouldn't have minded if I had friends to share it with. It was kind of like it was something that I did with. I didn't know anybody else who liked that kind of music, and there's a little loneliness in that too.
Yeah. Did you and your dad share that in common though? Could you
We
talk to
liked
him
it together, but we never sat around and just listened to records together. He would put some on at night. I mean, and the weekends on they would have a party. My parents would have a party, and they'd put on Benny Goodman records to dance to, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Because that was the music that was popular when they were teenagers. And then sometime around when I was 13 years old, my parents sent me off to a summer camp.
Oh man, I love talking about summer camp. I can't wait. Go on.
And the thing about summer camp, besides it was fun, was that there were counselors who played the guitar and sang. And I had never met anybody who played the guitar and sang until I went to summer camp.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, I mean, I had already heard folk music, and I liked Pete Seeger and the Burl Ives and the Weavers, Weavers had a couple of big hits in 1949, 50, 51, you know, with Irene Goodnight and on top of Old Smoky. They were folk music hits long before the folk music craze of the early 60s.
Was it were the Weavers being played on like what the equivalent of top 40 radio
Yes.
was? Oh, it's wild.
Yeah, but they were backed up by an orchestra, and so they made commercial records, and they had about 3 or 4 major hits. I mean, like number one. They had Irene Goodnight was a number one hit on the radio, written by Leadbelly, who had died just like 6 months before the song became a huge.
Oh man, that's too bad.
Yeah. So I fell in love with folk music as well. And so here I am loving early jazz and loving folk music independently. And to me, they were 2 completely different kinds of music.
So you like these 2 different styles of music, folk and jazz. Can you maybe tell the story of how you thought to bring those together?
That's the interesting part to me for my life. I really thought of them as 2 completely different kinds of music, because folk music was like ballads and Appalachian songs and like say Pete Seeger, you know, and jazz was jazz. But no, and remember, in 1950, if you said you loved jazz, you were most likely talking about what was popular in jazz or what was happening in the avant-garde of jazz of the day. You know, and then you'd be talking about Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker and bebop and progressive jazz. That's not the jazz I liked. I liked it okay, but what I was in love with was the early jazz from the 20s and early 30s. But anyway, that's just a distinction that was important to me. So I loved early jazz. That's why I always say early jazz, so to distinguish it from the other jazz. I loved early jazz and I loved folk music. Then I went to college. I graduated high school and went to college in 1958 and went to Boston University. And
Terriers?
Pardon me?
Is it the BU Terriers?
BU, Terrier, yeah. BU.
Go Terriers.
And I started hearing people playing swingier folk songs that were jumpy and jazzy. Especially there was this one guy who was around in the day, his name was Eric von Schmidt. And I loved his music, and I wanted to hear him play at the very well-known folk venue of the time called the Club 47 in Harvard Square.
Now Club Passim.
Now Passim. And he was playing, one of the songs he played was Buddy Bolden's Blues. He was just playing the guitar and singing the song. But I knew it as a Jelly Roll Morton jazz tune, early jazz tune. And it was like, wow, you can do that? You can take these old jazz songs and play them on the guitar and sing them kind of like a folk song. And it was like a light bulb went off in my brain. It was like, oh my God, all these songs all this style of music, this swing, ragtime, jumpy music that I loved so much, could actually be played and sung on the guitar. And that headed me off in the direction. And then I started finding people like Jesse Fuller and Pink Anderson and Blind Blake and all these other earlier 20s artists who did similar things, and then eventually led me to the early jug bands, the Memphis Jug Band, the Dixieland Jug Blowers, the Gus Cannon's Jug Stompers, all of whom were basically doing that. They were playing old-time jazz on folk music instruments, and that's what jug band is.
Yeah, can you give a little bit more historical background of the jug band?
Well, jug bands started in the early part of the 20th century. They were first recorded around 1926. There were 3 major jug bands. They were all black musicians who lived in the South. The 3 most famous was the Memphis Jug Band, obviously from Memphis, Gus Cannon's Jug Stompers, also from Memphis, and the Dixieland Jug Blowers from Louisville. They usually consisted of a jug player who took the bass line. Jug was kind of like a folk version of a tuba. Homemade instruments, washboards, wash tubs, kazoos, harmonicas, fiddles, you know. And they started, I'm sure I wasn't there, you know, and nobody that's around now was, but they started before they were going before they were recorded, and you just have to assume that these guys were just jamming together. They were just, a guy would play the guitar and sing a song, and somebody would join in on a harmonica or somebody to fiddle, and before you know it, somebody's playing the washboard, and then I'm sure they just grew out of the local music scene.
Yeah.
And then when the record companies, the big record companies, finally in the mid-20s finally realized there was a market for rural music, they discovered these jug bands, and those three became quite popular.
Do you think the using the jug was just out of necessity of not having, the money to buy an actual instrument?
I think that's a lot to do with it. I'm sure those guys were dirt poor, and most of them, maybe a few of them had, they probably had jobs other than being musicians. Some of them I know did. But even the ones that were musicians were playing on the streets, and they maybe in a bar, they weren't making a lot of money, and nobody could afford hundreds of dollars for a tuba.
Right.
But that's true. The washboard was something you could buy at the hardware store with some thimbles, and that you couldn't, if you couldn't afford a drum set, you could play the washboard, and if you couldn't afford a trumpet, you could play a kazoo, and harmonicas were not that expensive. Fiddles were a little more expensive, but you could usually find an inexpensive one in a pawn shop or something like that. So they were rural people. Mm-hmm. So they tended more towards rural music, and they didn't read music. They weren't like, most of them didn't go to conservatories. So they were playing by ear. Mm-hmm. And they were singing, a lot of the guys just sang blues. A large percentage of the early jug band music was blues, country blues, but they were, these guys a lot of them were playing the guitar or the banjo and playing blues, and then these other guys would just join in on, jugs and washboards and wash tubs and harmonicas and fiddles and whatever other instruments were easy to obtain and didn't cost a lot of money. And that's basically how jug bands started. Mm-hmm. And they became very popular in their area. I mean, it wasn't like a big national craze,
right,
but they sold quite a few records.
Like regionally successful.
Yeah, regionally and in the South from about 1925 to 1935. And then, like most of the rural music, it lost its popularity or lost its ability to be recorded because of the Depression. People just couldn't afford to buy records.
Oh, right. Wow. Okay.
So that's why there was a big change in the recording industry.
It's interesting to think about, like that aspect of like the Depression sort of like devastating the progress of music.
What I've heard, I don't know if this statistic is 100% accurate, but it's close. In 1928, there were 50 million records pressed. And by 1933, there were 5 million records pressed.
Wow.
That's how devastated the record. And not only because of the Depression, but also because of radio.
Oh, interesting.
Because people could listen to music for free if they had a radio. They didn't have to go out and buy a record.
Right.
So it also affected the sale of records. And it didn't really pick up again until World War II, when people started having money again, when the economy came back.
Interesting. Can you tell the story of how the Jim Kweskin Jug Band came together? It's a pretty interesting one.
Well, let me say that in the early 60s, as I was learning how to play the guitar and starting to perform, I started learning these what people called ragtime. It really wasn't classic ragtime. That's a whole other thing. That's another genre altogether. That's Scott Joplin, and that's a world that was wonderful music. I love it, but that's not really what I played. But I played ragtimey kind of folk songs, jazzy kind of folk songs. And I had learned them from recordings by mostly people from most people in the 20s and 30s, but some of them I learned from the actual people themselves. Who were still around, they had recorded in the 20s, and this is the 60s. They were 40 years older, so if they were in their 20s at the time, they were in their 60s now. They were still around, Jesse Fuller and then many of these other, Pink Anderson, and many of them were still kicking. But anyway, I would meet them, and I would learn songs from them. I learned Sugar Babe from Mance Lipscomb. I learned Good Time Charlie's Back in Town Again from Spider John Kerner, who was my contemporary. I heard records and learned a lot of these old tunes. If I Could Shimmy Like My Sister Kate was an old jazz tune and stuff like that. Anyway, so I was starting to play ragtimey, jazzy folk music, traveling around the country, learning songs, meeting people with record collections, meeting artists who played also that kind of music. Rag Mama first by Blind Boy Fuller, and then I learned it from Steve Talbot in Berkeley and blah, blah, blah. By the time I got back to Cambridge, after I'd been in and out a number of times traveling around the country, I was doing gigs at the Club 47 and playing this kind of music, and often getting other people to jam on stage with me. Harmonica players and fiddle players and other singers and mandolins and fiddles, banjo, whatever. Sometimes we'd have 5, 6, 7 of us on stage just jamming. Not necessarily, we'd be in the back room, work up a couple of tunes just for the fun of it, and get up on stage and play them for the audience, And it was always billed as the Jim Kweskin. It wasn't Jim Kweskin Band. It was supposed to be my gig, but I would just drag people up on stage with me. So, unbeknownst to me, one night at the Club 47, the president of Vanguard Records was in the audience. His name is Maynard Solomon. He's the guy who a year earlier had signed Joan Baez, and they had Mimi and Dick Farina, Ian and Sylvia, Buffy St. Marie.
Did he live in Cambridge?
No, they were in New York.
Oh.
He came up from New York. The Vanguard was a New York record company. Anyway, I didn't know he was there, but after the show, he came up to me and said, "I love your music. How would you like to make a record with that band?" And I said, "Well, I'd love to make a record, but that's not a band.
Right.
Give me 3 or 4 months and I'll put a band together and I'll make a record for you." And so I had a record contract before I had a band.
That was not typical at the time?
Totally not typical.
Yeah.
I mean, who hires somebody to put together a band to make a record?
Right. Like hiring somebody to build a house who doesn't know.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm interested in
and
it.
I had never led a band.
Yeah.
I didn't have I had jammed with people, but I'd never led a band. Anyway, I went around, found the people that I wanted to be in the Jug Band at the time, some really good musicians, friends of mine. I could name them if you would like me to.
Sure, go for it.
First person I called was Fritz Richmond, who was a fantastic washtub bass player. He'd been around the Boston, Cambridge scene, for a long time. He was still my age, but he was a little year older than me. But
How old were you at the time that this was all
23.
20, yeah. It's the magic age when it all comes together.
And so I called Fritz, who happened to be in California at the time that happened, and I said, "Hey, I'm forming a jug band, and you got to play the washtub bass, and you got to learn how to play the jug." And he did. And that's a whole other story, but he became a master jug player, actually. Wow. There's recordings of him, or he played a number of times on the Prairie Home Companion, playing things like the Flight of the Bumblebee on the jug.
Oh, my gosh. Wow.
Yeah, it was great. Anyway, so I called Fritz, and I said, "Come on back. We're performing a band." And then I was not a blues singer. I sang jazzy songs, and I needed, for a jug band, you need, some of it's got to be blues, a lot of it's got to be blues. So, the person I had performed with at other shows, not on the same bill together, not that we played music together, but we were on the same bill together, was Jeff Moldor. And he was 2 years younger than me, so he was only like 20 or 21.
You have to the drinking age was not 21 at the time?
I think it was 18.
Yeah.
But,
didn't have to sneak them into clubs.
But Club 47 didn't serve alcohol.
Right.
Still doesn't. It was a coffee house.
They do now.
Oh, they do?
Yeah.
They serve wine?
Wine and beer.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I got Jeff Moldor to do the blues, and then I needed a banjo player, so the only one I knew was Bob Siggins, who was the banjo player with the Charles River Valley Boys, who told me he would join the band, but he could only be for 6 months or so because he had to go off and be a scientist. He was which he did he was a physicist actually for the rest of his life. He also played banjo, but he gave up his full-time job was a physicist. Anyway, Bob Siggins on banjo, and then my friend David Simon, who was a harmonica player and also sang. So that was the first jug band, and we rehearsed for like 3 or 4 months, and worked up a whole bunch of tunes from songs we'd heard, songs we found, songs that people. I mean, we did a song called "Washington at Valley Forge," which was taught to me by Dave Van Ronk. I don't know if you know who that is,
Yeah.
but or was. Anyway, we made our first record with that group. And that was the formation of the jug band.
Were there other jug bands around at that time?
Well, we were the first one to actually start to what you'd call the jug band thing. But very shortly after we started, there was a guy who was with Elektra Records, a producer for Elektra Records named Paul Rothchild, who actually went on to produce Janis Joplin and The Doors and like later on. But right then, he heard us and he wanted us to record for Elektra. And I said, well, no, I already promised Maynard Solomon I'd do for Vanguard.
Was it a bidding war?
Huh?
Was there a bidding war?
Well, it was not a bidding war, but there was competition. But I refused. Maynard's the one who, inspired me to put the band together in the first place and said he'd make a record with us, and I wasn't about to jump to ship to another record company. So he decided to put together his own jug band, and he put together a jug band in New York called the Even Dozen Jug Band. And that had a stellar lineup of musicians, who many of them went on to incredibly good musical careers, like David Grisman, Maria Muldaur, who was Maria D'Amato at the time, John Sebastian, Stefan Grossman.
Do the Welcome Back, Kotter?
Yeah.
Song? John Sebastian.
Well, he was also the lead singer and songwriter for the Love and Spoonful.
Oh, there you go.
He wrote What a Day for a Daydream and Do You Believe in Magic and Summer in the City.
So he's written some songs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he still plays jug band music.
Oh, wow.
And other stuff, but his moniker is Jug Band Man. So he was definitely at the jug bands. But anyway, our jug band was the first one to start the new craze of jug band music. That was, not craze, but the popularity of jug band music.
Can you talk about what it might have been like during that time to come on to such like an established folk scene? Maybe like a little bit about what that scene was like when you started playing the jug band style, and what it was like to do something so completely different and what you brought to that scene.
Well, we were different in many ways. We weren't just different in the kind of music we played. Because remember, by 1963, folk music was popular. It started to get popular in '58 when the Kingston Trio had a big hit of Tom Dooley. And that spread around, and all of a sudden there was folk acts popping up. It was the Journeymen and the Chad Mitchell Trio and the Highwaymen and the Brothers Four, and there were all these commercial folk acts. Eventually, it's Peter, Paul, and Mary. So folk music was popular, and these were acts that were like very formal. They wore uniforms. They wore similar clothes. They had a set comedy patter. They would tell the same stories. Everything was a performance, a show that they were slick and ready to put on. We got up on stage. We wore our street clothes. We talked about whatever the heck we wanted to talk about. We just made up stuff, and just talked about what's happening that day. We were very informal. It was kind of like the beginning of folk music just being folks, like just natural.
Right, less theatrical.
Exactly. We had no shtick, as they say in show business. So there was that difference. And we were playing a music that nobody had ever, at least none of the young audiences that we were now playing for, college audiences mostly, had ever heard before. But they loved it. I mean, my band was an immediate success. I mean, as soon as we got out, as soon as we started performing, we were very, very, very well accepted. And we immediately started playing the Newport Folk Festival, and we got on national TV. And it was very, gratifying. That's when my parents finally accepted the fact that I was a musician. They didn't.
They weren't buying it before.
No, they wanted me to go to business school as a backup, which I did for a little while. But
Is that what you went for at BU?
at first? Yeah, yeah, and then and then finally when the jug band got on television and all over concerts and playing in Carnegie Hall and all these places, then they finally said, "Oh, I guess that's what he's going to do with his life."
Oh, wow. So I heard that you visited with Woody Guthrie.
One time, Bob Dylan took me to meet him. He was at a hospital facility in Brooklyn. Woody was sick with Huntington's disease, Huntington's chorea, it's called. He was very shaky. It's a nerve disorder, and he was not fully control of his body. He was sad, but he sure loved Bob Dylan because what he wanted when we went there, all he wanted was Bob to sing him his Woody songs.
Oh wow, that's so funny! Like sing my songs.
Yeah, well, but he didn't. It's not even that he said that. He couldn't even say. He could hardly talk. He was very shaky.
Yeah.
His body was very, like his limbs were flailing around a lot. It was very. That's what I mean. It was sad, But he could smoke still, which he did. He was famous for smoking cigarettes, and Dylan sang songs for him, and he loved it. I just sat there and they had the relationship. Dylan had been to see him a number of times, and Woody really liked him a lot. So I just sat back and watched them interact with each other.
That's incredible, to be a fly on the wall.
Yeah.
For that moment.
Yeah.
And what was your connection to Bob Dylan?
Well, we were both young in the Greenwich Village. I was in the village for a number of months in the winter of '62, and I got a gig at the Gaslight Cafe, and there was 4 shows a night at the Gaslight Cafe. The first set was Peter Stampfel. I don't know if you know who that is, but he eventually formed the Holy Modal Rounders. And then the second set was me, and the third set was Dylan, and the fourth set was the 3 of us together as a trio. And that went on for a couple of weeks. So that's where I first, and then we were hanging out in the village together. When he was 22 and I was 23, he was 21 and I was 22, something like that.
So in the program book for Dylan's first New York show, he lists his favorite singers, which included you. Is that true?
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, did he ever tell you that, hey, you're one
Well,
of
he
my
called me
favorites?
up on stage to perform with him at the Gertie's Folk City, which I did. He had his first gig at Gertie's, and I was just sitting there in the audience, and he called me up, said, "Come up." And we did a couple songs together.
Well, your name was in the program, apparently.
It was? Oh, I didn't know that. But anyway, I wasn't on the. I don't know. I guess so. But yeah, I actually have a recording of that.
Oh, you do?
Of me and him together.
Wow.
It's not that good.
It's not your favorite. Were you at the '65 Newport Folk Fest?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, where Dylan went electric.
Oh yeah.
What was your take on that?
My jug band, we were at the Newport Folk Festival in 1964, 65, 66, 67, and 68. 5 years in a row. And my take on it was basically that it was just too loud. It wasn't bad music. It was good music. I mean, if you ever seen the film Festival, have you ever seen the film Festival?
I don't think so.
Oh, you should see that film. Murray Lerner made a film called Festival, and all it is the music from the Newport Folk Festival. If you don't have it, I could get you a DVD of it. Do you have a DVD player?
I do. It's
I'll
a
get you one.
Blu-ray, but it plays DVDs.
Good, because I'll get you one. But anyway, Dylan did songs like Maggie's Farm, and it was with the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. Mm-hmm. So the other guitar player, the one who was doing all the crazy, wonderful stuff, was Mike Bloomfield, who was the original guitar player, electric guitar player with the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, and it was Sammy Lay on drums and Jerome, I forget his exact last name, on bass. Getting old, I forget people's names.
You've mentioned many names.
Anyway, it was the Paul Butterfield Blues Band without Paul Butterfield. They were backing up Dylan, and it was nothing wrong. It was great. Music was great, but what happened is, you imagine you're sitting there in an audience, listening to Joan Baez or people like Theodore Bickel or Judy Collins with their guitars singing quiet, beautiful ballads and folk music, and all of a sudden, on comes this band with ear-splitting volume. I mean, just ear-splitting. It was so loud it hurt your ears, and that's
Wow.
what drove everybody crazy. It was the wrong time. It was the wrong.
Also, kind of sounds like it was a bad mix.
Yeah, well, it was just too loud.
Yeah.
And of course, the ones on stage, they didn't know. They couldn't tell. They were so loud. They were just in the groove.
So, Club 47, now Club Passim, we
Yeah.
talked about that quite a bit. It was a huge part of your career. What did it mean to you to play there and be part of that Club 47 world?
Well, there was a very sharing scene. In many ways, the music of the scene of those days was people gathering together. We would have parties. We would share songs. Oh, have you heard this one? Oh, listen to this. Oh, do this one with me. Blah blah blah. Back and forth. Eric von Schmidt and Dick Farina, Mimi and Dick Farina, and Jeff Muldor and me and Joan and people coming in who were coming from New York who were passing through. Could be Dylan, it could be Dave Van Ronk. It could be many different artists who were Richie Havens. Tim Hardin was there. You know Tim Hardin?
Mm-hmm. See, Lady came from Baltimore.
Yeah.
And
If I Were a Carpenter.
Yep. Oh, really? And then Reason to Believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
The old Rod Stewart song.
So it was a scene, but it was a very non-competitive scene, which is what I loved so much about it. It wasn't like somebody out trying to outdo each other, trying to play faster, trying to play better, trying to sing louder. There was a togetherness about it, which I absolutely loved, and that lasted a good several years. And then, of course, like everything else, it faded away into getting older or getting careers or becoming famous or not becoming famous or but for a number of years it was really wonderful.
Can you talk a little bit more about your connection with Jeff Muldar, and like what works about your collaboration? And from what I understand, there was a chunk of time where you stopped playing together but came back to playing together.
So Jeff Muldor and I, first time we played in any venue together, or at least in the same venue, there was a concert that somebody put on. It was just the two of us, but I think we did one or two songs together, but it was called The Bittersweet Blues of Jeff Muldor and the Good Time Music of Jim Kweskin. And he did the first set, I did the second set. I think we did a couple. So I went over to his apartment, and I think, we just got to know each other a little bit. And I loved his singing. It was just a really good blues singer, and he was a very talented musician. And so that's the reason why when it came time to form the Jug Band, he was, top choice.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted him for the band because he was such a good blues singer. And also it turned out, which I didn't know at the time, he was also a great arranger. And he arranged a lot of the songs, the tempos and the keys and the harmonies and all that kind of stuff. So it was a good collaboration, and we worked well together. We fought a lot, we argued a lot, we still do. We still get mad at each other all the time, But
That's, I feel like, a mark of a good relationship where you can get mad at get mad at your friends.
And mad at your friends, yeah, and still they're your friends.
Yeah.
And so we were in the Jug Band together for the 5 years, and then I broke up the band in '68, and then he went off and did his many things. He made albums with Maria. He made some albums. He was with another Paul Butterfield band called Better Days. He quit music for a while and was working in Detroit doing computer work and for a big company in Detroit, and so we didn't see each other. And then in '05, Fritz Richmond, the one I was telling you about, the washtub bass player, passed away. And at the same time, there was this man doing a documentary on the history of jug band music. It's called Chasing Gus's Ghost. You should have a copy of that, too.
Okay.
I
Good
have
thing
one of
we're
those.
recording this, so I can go back and check it all out.
Yeah. Anyway, Fritz died, so there were people who wanted to do some benefit, or not benefit, but memorial concerts. And also, the guy who was doing the documentary wanted to do a concert to promote the documentary, both here in the States and in Japan, where they love jug band music, actually.
Wow.
So Jeff and I got together again, and we hit it off musically. I mean, and our relationship hadn't changed one bit. I mean, it's still the same today as it was in 1962. We still fight all the time and argue and give each other a hard time and love each other and have a wonderful time. Matter of fact, I'm doing some gigs with him coming up this summer.
Oh, wow. Do you feel like Jeff is kind of a past life friend?
I don't know. Maybe so.
Yeah.
We did an album together about 3 years ago called Penny's Farm, and I'm very proud of that album. It's quite, it's a good collaboration. Anybody hears this, get it on CD, baby. So Jeff and I go back a long way, and it's a good collaboration. We really enjoy playing music together.
Okay, so we do this thing called the lightning round.
Okay.
It's only going to take a couple minutes.
Okay.
All right. Basic Folk is brought to you in part by Tina and Her Pony, a queer duo bringing traditional Appalachian music and vocal harmonies into the 21st century. Visit tinaandherpony.com. And thanks to WIUP in Indiana, Pennsylvania, which airs Basic Folk 2 p.m. Eastern every Saturday. You can listen on 90.1 if you're in the Indiana, PA area, or at their website, wiupfm.org. All right, here we go. So, do you like dogs, cats, or something else?
Dogs.
What is your...
No, both.
Okay. That answer is also acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a dog or a cat?
Have had, not right now.
Okay. What is your coffee order?
Mint tea.
What's the first album you bought with your own money?
The first record I bought with my own money was Fats Domino doing Maybelline and Chuck Berry. No, I mean Chuck Berry doing Maybelline and Fats Domino doing Ain't That a Shame. They were 78s. I was 15 years old.
Do you remember how much they were?
In the cents, 39 cents, maybe something like that.
That's pretty cool. Do you remember the first concert you went to?
Yes. I went to a midnight concert at Carnegie Hall, a memorial concert for Charlie Parker, and it started at midnight. And I had two aunts who lived in New York City and took me there, and it was like all the great jazz musicians of the day were there.
It started at midnight?
It started at midnight.
And
Went on until 4 o'clock in the
old were
morning. I was 14 or 15.
Did you make it all the way to 4 a.m.?
They didn't, so they took me and I had to leave. I would have.
Oh, it sounds like me. Are you a morning person or a night owl?
Night.
When you play guitar, Gibson, Martin, or Fender?
Martin.
If you could choose one, flying or invisibility?
Flying.
All right, great. Jim Kweskin, thank you for doing the lightning round and for taking so much time to talk to us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks. So during that interview, Jim tells me that I need to see the documentary festival and the documentary about the history of jug band music called Chasin' Gus's Ghost. And to his credit, afterwards, he was like, send me your mailing address and I'll send you those DVDs. And I was like, okay, yeah, sure, Jim. And I sent it to him, and 5 to 7 days later in the mail, I had 2 DVDs. They're right here. So thanks a lot, Jim Kweskin, for being a good on your word. Thanks to Laura McCarthy for producing Basic Folk. Lindsay Myers is our business manager. Alex Stanton of Townspeople does our music. I'm Cindy House. You can subscribe to our newsletter at cindyhouse.net. That's also where you can find show notes and previous episodes of Basic Folk. You can join our Facebook group, Basic Folk Basics is what it's called. And we'll talk to you next week. Thanks so much for listening to Basic Folk. Bye.